The night was silent and cold, and the fields stretched like a dark ocean under the alien sky. A small figure moved carefully through the tall plants. Her hands trembled as she pulled one stalk and then another, and tucked them under her thin cloth. She was hungry and weak, and the sound of her stomach was louder than the wind. She knew if she was caught, the punishment would be cruel, but if she did not steal, there would be nothing to eat for her the next day. The girl had stolen before, but always, small pieces, never enough to fill her. She was afraid and desperate, and tonight her eyes were red from crying. She whispered to herself again and again that she had no choice. She told herself she would return the favor one day somehow if she survived. This night she thought the farm was empty. The human who owned the fields was said to be strong and harsh. Some villagers told stories about him and warned each other never to cross his land. Yet hunger was stronger than fear, and the girl moved forward, step by step. A sudden light cut through the dark, and she froze. A lamp flickered on, and a tall shadow rose from the farmhouse. The girl gasped and dropped the food. Her body stiffened, and she wished to vanish, but the heavy steps drew closer. The human stood over her with sharp eyes that glowed like fire in the dim light. "What are you doing here?" His voice was deep and heavy like rolling stones. The girl trembled and fell to her knees. Her words broke into pieces, but she tried to speak. She said she was sorry. She said she was only trying to live. She begged him not to be angry and not to call the guards. She promised she would pay somehow, even though she had nothing to give. The human studied her. He saw her thin frame and her bruised arms. He saw that her feet were bare and cut from sharp rocks. She was not a thief out of greed. She was a creature of hunger and despair. The silence was long and painful. The girl could feel her heart beating like a drum in her chest. She thought he might strike her or drag her away. Instead, his voice came again, softer this time. He asked if she had a family. She shook her head. She told him she had no one left, and that she had been living alone since the war took her people. Her tears glistened in. The light in her body shook like a leaf in a storm. She whispered that she would do anything if he spared her. She would work his fields by day with all her strength. She would warm him by night if he desired. She said she had nothing else to offer. The human stood still. His eyes narrowed and he breathed slow. He felt the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He was not a man who easily gave trust, but the image of the starving girl burned in his mind. He had seen battlefields and ruined cities, and he had seen creatures left behind to die. Yet something about her voice made his heart stir in a way he did not expect. The girl bent lower, almost pressing her forehead to the soil. Her voice cracked as she begged again. She told him she would never steal again. She told him she would belong to him in any way he asked. She only wished to be allowed to live. The human turned his face toward the distant hills where dawn would soon rise. He thought of his lonely farm and the silence that had followed him for years. He thought of his work and his nights without company. He thought of how trust could be dangerous, yet he also thought of how life without risk was empty. At last he spoke. His words came out slow and steady. He told her to stand and look him in the eyes. She obeyed, though her body shook. He told her that stealing was wrong, but dying in hunger was worse. He said he would decide her fate when the sun rose. The girl nodded. Her tears fell to the ground. But in her heart a small spark of hope lit for the first time in many days. The night dragged slowly after the human spoke, and the girl could not sleep. She sat on the edge of the wooden porch staring at the ground. Her stomach still twisted with hunger, but her fear was stronger. She kept thinking about his words that he would decide her fate when the sun rose. She wondered if she would be cast out, or beaten, or even handed over to the guards. The human walked around the farmhouse carrying tools and checking the animals. He moved with calm steps, but his eyes always seemed to watch her. She felt his gaze heavy upon her, and it made her heart race. She did not understand why he had not already thrown her out. Still, she stayed low and quiet, afraid that any sound might anger him. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, the human came to her side. His hands were rough and strong, his face lined with years of hard work. He told her to follow him, and she obeyed with trembling steps. They crossed the wide fields where green stalks swayed in the cold wind. He pointed at the rows of crops and said that work was heavy here and he had few helpers. He told her if she wished to eat, she must give her strength to the land. The girl nodded quickly. She promised she would work harder than anyone. She bent down at once and began pulling weeds, though her hands shook from weakness. The soil was cold and sharp stones cut her skin, but she did not stop. She wanted to prove herself before he changed his mind. The human watched her for a long moment. Then he turned away to tend his tasks. Hours passed as the sun climbed higher. The girl's arms ached and her legs trembled, yet she pushed on. Sweat dripped down her face and mixed with dust. Her hair clung to her cheeks and her breath came in ragged waves. Still, she refused to stop. She feared that if she faltered, the human would send her away. At midday, he returned carrying a small basket of bread and water. He placed it on the ground near her and spoke only one word. Her eyes widened and her throat tightened. She whispered thanks and grabbed the bread with shaking hands. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it was treasure. The water soothed her dry throat and gave her new life. She wanted to cry, but she held back, afraid of showing weakness. When she finished, she stood quickly and returned to work. The human gave a short nod, though no smile touched his lips. He seemed carved from stone, yet his eyes softened for a brief moment. The girl noticed but said nothing. She only kept digging and clearing the soil as the sun began to set. Her body nearly collapsed. She could no longer feel her fingers yet. She forced herself to keep moving. At last, the human called her to stop. He told her she had done enough for the day. He led her back to the farmhouse where the air smelled of smoke and wood. He pointed to a small corner inside with a blanket on the floor. He said she could rest there tonight, but she must rise early tomorrow. The girl bowed her head in thanks. She curled under the blanket, though it was rough and thin. To her, it felt like a gift of gold. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in many nights, she felt safe. The human sat near the fire, staring at the flames. His mind wrestled with questions. Why had he allowed her to stay? Why had he given her food? Why did her desperate eyes linger in his thoughts? He told himself it was only practical. She could work the fields and ease his burden. Yet deep inside, he felt a pull stronger than reason, a pull that whispered of companionship in his lonely life. The girl drifted to sleep unaware of his thoughts. Her dreams were filled with light and warmth. Though her future was uncertain, she carried hope in her heart. And in that silent farmhouse, two lives that had once walked separate roads began to move slowly toward each other. The morning came with the cry of birds and the soft glow of rising sun. The girl woke before the human, expecting him to push her away, yet he only pointed toward the fields and gave her a tool. She gripped it with weak hands and followed him across the damp ground. The air was cold, and her breath turned white in the light, but her spirit was fixed on proving herself. The human moved, with steady pace, bending and lifting with strong arms. The girl tried to copy his movements, though her muscles screamed with pain. She refused to stop. She pulled weeds, carried water, and turned soil until her back felt broken. The human watched her, from time to time his face unreadable, but his silence meant she was not failing. She held on to that fragile comfort and worked harder. By midday, her arms shook, and her legs nearly gave way. The human finally stopped and motioned for her to sit, brought her a bowl of hot stew and thick bread. Her eyes widened, for she had not tasted such food in years. She ate carefully, savoring each spoonful, while her heart swelled with gratitude. She whispered thanks again and again, while the human simply nodded as if he understood without words. After the meal, the human set her to lighter tasks. He asked her to gather dry wood for the fire and to feed the animals in the pen. She obeyed quickly, though fear lingered in her chest. She was not used to kindness, and she wondered if it was a trick. Yet as the day stretched on, no harsh words came, only more work and more food. When night fell, she sat near the fire with him. Her body was sore, but her heart carried strange warmth. The flames painted his face with light and shadow. She studied his hands as they rested on his knees, strong and scarred like stone. She studied his eyes that looked into the fire, yet sometimes flicked toward her with a weight she could not name. She felt the silence heavy between them, and at last she broke it. She told him again she would do anything to repay him. She offered her labor and her presence. She offered even the warmth of her body, if that was the price of her place here. The human lifted his gaze and held her eyes for a long time. His stare was not cruel, but it cut through her words. He said nothing of her offer. Instead, he asked her name. She paused, unsure how long it had been since anyone cared to know. She whispered it softly, almost afraid it would sound wrong in his ears. He repeated it once, and the sound from his lips made her chest tighten. She realized no one had spoken her name with such weight in many seasons. The fire cracked and sparks flew upward. The human spoke again in his slow, steady tone. He said she could stay as long as she worked and did not steal again. He told her she would not need to offer her body for shelter or food. He told her she was safe here if she kept her promise. Her breath caught at his words, and she lowered her head with tears in her eyes. She whispered that she would never betray his trust. That night she lay under the thin blanket, yet her heart was fuller than ever. She thought of his voice calling her name. She thought of the food that filled her stomach and the work that gave her a place. She thought of safety, which she had not felt since the war took everything from her. She hugged the blanket tight, and for the first time she dreamed not of fear but of hope. The human sat awake longer, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. His thoughts swirled like storm clouds. He told himself it was simple. He needed hands for the farm, and she needed food. Yet a part of him deeper than reason told him that her arrival carried meaning. Perhaps she was a test, or perhaps she was a chance to end his years of silence. He could not know the answer yet, but as he closed his eyes, he felt the weight of her presence beside him, and he did not feel alone. The days passed slowly, and the girl settled into the rhythm of the farm. She rose at dawn and worked the fields beside the human. Her hands became rough and her skin darkened under the sun, but her spirit grew stronger. Each task she completed made her feel less like a thief and more like someone who belonged. The human spoke little yet. His silence carried a kind of steady comfort. One morning, a storm gathered over the hills. Dark clouds rolled like waves, and the wind whipped through the stalks. The human ordered her to help him tie down the barn doors and cover the supplies. She ran through the rain, her feet sinking into the mud, and her hair clinging to her face. She obeyed his every command, though her body was drenched and cold. Together they fought the storm until at last the worst had passed. They returned to the farmhouse, dripping with water and shivering from the chill inside. By the fire, she sat wrapped in the thin blanket, watching him place wood on the flames. She whispered her thanks for allowing her to stay and work. He turned his eyes toward her, and for the first time she saw a faint smile touch his lips. It was small and brief, yet it filled her with warmth stronger than the fire. She realized then that he was not only her master of survival, but also the first soul who had shown her something close to kindness in a long time. That night, as the wind howled outside, she dared to speak more. She told him pieces of her story. She spoke of her village burned in the war. She told him how her family was lost and how she had wandered alone searching for scraps of food. She admitted she had stolen many times, but always with guilt. Always with the fear of punishment. She said meeting him had been different because instead of chains he had given her work, and instead of blows he had given her bread. The human listened in silence. His eyes did not leave the fire, yet she felt he absorbed every word. When she finished, she braced herself for judgment. Instead, he spoke slowly, saying that life on this world was cruel to many, and that survival often forced hands into dark deeds. He said he understood, and that while stealing was wrong, her honesty now carried more weight than her crime. Her chest tightened and she lowered her head with tears that would not stop. As days became weeks, she noticed how his habits began to shift. He started sharing meals with her at the same table rather than leaving food at her side. He began asking her opinion on small matters like when to harvest a row or how to arrange the animals. He even taught her how to mend tools and how to guide the oxen in the fields. Each new skill he gave her was a gift, and each one pulled her further from the shadow of being a thief. Yet whispers from the nearby village began to reach her ears. Whenever she went to fetch supplies, she heard the locals speak of the human and the strange girl working his land. Some called her a servant. Others spread cruel words claiming she had offered herself to him for shelter. The words stung her, but she stayed silent. She knew the truth was more complex, but fear rose in her heart that the human might one day listen. To them one evening when the sky turned red, she confessed her worry. She told him of the whispers and of her fear that his trust in her would break. He looked at her with eyes steady as stone and told her that what others said was nothing compared to what he saw with his own eyes. He said he saw her labor, her loyalty, and her courage, and that no rumor could erase that. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a moment she could not speak. She only nodded with tears sliding down her face. That night she lay awake under her blanket, but her heart carried new strength. For the first time in her wandering life, she felt not just safe, but valued. She did not know where this bond would lead, yet she knew she would fight with all she had to protect. The season turned warmer and the fields grew thick with crops. The girl worked from sunrise to sunset with sweat pouring down her back, yet she no longer felt only pain. She felt purpose with every seed she planted and every stalk she carried. Her body had grown stronger and her heart steadier. The human still spoke little, but his actions spoke more. He shared his tools, his meals, and even moments of quiet rest beside her. One morning she noticed trouble at the edge of the land. Strangers from the village stood near the fence, their voices sharp and mocking. They pointed at her and laughed, calling her names, saying she was no better than a beggar who sold herself for bread. The girl froze with shame, but the human stepped forward. His broad shoulders blocked their sight and his voice thundered across the air. He told them to leave his farm and mind their own work. The strangers muttered curses, but they backed away. The girl watched him with wide eyes, her chest filled with fire. She realized then that he had not only offered her shelter but also protection. That night she tried to thank him. Her voice shook as she admitted she feared being nothing more than a burden. He looked at her for a long time before answering. He told her she was not a burden but a worker who carried her share of the land. He reminded her how many weeds she had cleared, how many animals she had cared for, and how many days she had labored without complaint. His words struck her deeper than any kindness she had known. She lowered her head and whispered she would never betray his trust. Days later, another test arrived. A wild beast from the forest crept into the fields at night, tearing into the animals. The girl awoke to the sound of panic and rushed outside with only a stick in her hand. The human already faced the beast with a torch and a blade. She joined him, though fear gripped her chest. Together they shouted and struck until the creature fled into the darkness. Her arms shook and her breath came in gasps, but she stood her ground beside him. When the danger passed, he placed his hand on her shoulder and said she had courage stronger than fear. Her heart swelled at his words. The bond between them grew quietly, yet steadily. She began to understand his ways, how he preferred action over talk, and how his silence was filled with thought. She learned to read the faint shifts in his eyes, the small curve of his lips, the subtle nods that meant approval. She found herself smiling at him without reason and felt warmth whenever he called her name. Still, doubts haunted her in secret. When she lay under her blanket at night, she wondered what future awaited her. Was she only a worker? Was she truly safe? Was there space in his world for more than labor? Her heart whispered questions she dared not speak aloud. She feared that if she revealed them, he would cast her aside. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she gathered her courage. Her voice was soft, yet steady. She told him she was grateful beyond measure for all he had done. She said she would work the fields as long as her body could move, but she also admitted her soul longed for more than survival. She confessed she wished to be more than a servant, more than a shadow in his house. The human stared into the flames without speaking for a long while. The firelight danced across his face, showing lines of thought deep and heavy. At last he turned to her. His eyes met hers, and she felt the air thicken. Around them, he told her that trust was slow to grow, yet it was already taking root between them. He said her courage, her honesty, and her labor had given him reason to see her, not as a thief, not as a servant, but as a partner. Her breath caught, and tears blurred her vision. She whispered his name, trembling with hope. His voice was firm as he told her that if she wished to walk beside him, she must continue proving her heart true. She nodded without hesitation, knowing she would give every piece of herself to protect this fragile bond. That night she lay awake with a fire burning inside, not of fear but of hope. She knew storms still waited in the distance, yet she also knew she was no longer alone. The summer heat pressed heavy over the land, and the fields shimmered beneath the sun. The girl rose each morning with aching muscles, yet her spirit held firm. She no longer saw herself as a thief or a beggar. She saw herself as a worker who shared the burden of the farm, and as someone the human had begun to trust. Every day she tried to earn that trust with sweat and toil. One morning, as they harvested the crops together, the human spoke more than usual. His voice was low but clear. He told her about his past, about the war that had destroyed much of the land. He told her how he had once fought to protect lives, yet when the battles ended, he returned to find only silence waiting. For him, he had chosen the farm to escape the noise of war, but the quiet had turned into loneliness. The girl listened with wide eyes. She understood pain and loss, and she felt his words settle deep in her heart. Later that week, traders from the village came to bargain. They eyed the girl with suspicion, whispering cruel things about her. The human ignored them and continued his trade, but the girl felt the sting of every word. When the traders left, she asked if he believed what they said. He turned to her with steady eyes and told her he trusted what he saw with his own eyes, not the gossip of strangers. His words lifted her spirit, and she felt her chest grow warm with a strength she had never known. One evening, trouble came again. A group of men from the village arrived at the farm, their faces twisted with greed. They demanded payment, claiming the land belonged to them. The human stood firm, refusing to surrender his rights. The men grew angry, and one of them reached for the girl as if to drag her away. Fear surged in her, but before she could cry out, the human struck the man aside with a heavy hand. His voice thundered that no one would touch what was his. The men cursed and retreated into the night, but their threats lingered. In the air afterward, the girl sat by the fire, shaking. Her voice trembled as she asked why he risked himself for her. He looked at her without hesitation and said, because she was no longer a stranger on his land. She was part of his life now. His words echoed in her heart like a promise she had never dared to dream. She whispered that she would never leave him, no matter what dangers came. The days grew tense after that encounter. The girl noticed how he checked the fences more often and kept his blade near at hand. She tried to help with watch, but he always told her to rest. She refused to rest, though. Instead, she stayed close to him, ready to face whatever might come. Together, they worked in silence. But beneath that silence grew a bond that felt stronger than stone. One night, while they sat by the fire, she finally spoke her deepest fear. She told him she had nothing to offer but her work and her loyalty. She said she feared one day he would see her as unworthy and cast her out. The human reached across the space between them and placed his rough hand over hers. His touch was firm and steady. He told her she was already offering more than she knew. Her courage, her honesty, and her presence had given him something greater than he had known in years. She had given him companionship and hope. Her throat tightened and tears fell, though she tried to hide them. She whispered that she would give everything she had to protect this life they were building together. He nodded and told her that words meant little without action, but she had already shown him through her deeds. She smiled through her tears, and for the first time she felt like more than a survivor. She felt like someone who belonged. That night, as she lay under her blanket, she thought of his hand upon hers and the strength of his words. She thought of the danger that still lurked beyond the fields, yet she no longer trembled. She carried hope within her chest, and she knew that no matter what storms rose ahead, she would face them by his side. The days turned golden as the harvest neared completion. The fields stood heavy with grain swaying in the warm wind. The girl and the human worked side by side, their movements now smooth as if they had labored together for many years. Each glance between them carried meaning, though few words passed. The silence was no longer heavy, but filled with unspoken trust. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire, the girl stood at the edge of the field. She watched the horizon where smoke began to rise. Dark lines moved across the land, and soon she saw a group of armed men from the village approaching. Their shouts carried through the air, demanding once more that the farm be surrendered. She felt fear clutch her chest, but she did not run. Instead, she hurried to the human who had already taken his blade in hand. The men stormed onto the farm, shouting curses and threats. One of them declared the girl had bewitched the human and turned him against his own kind. Another spat that she was nothing but a thief and should be dragged back to the streets. The human stood tall before them, his voice like thunder. He declared the land was his, and the girl was under his protection. He told them no harm would touch her while he still drew breath. The men laughed and drew their weapons. A fight broke under the fading light. The human struck with the strength of years of labor, his blade flashing in the dusk. The girl, though afraid, did not hide. She grabbed a heavy staff and swung it with all her might beside him. Her arms shook and her legs trembled, yet she refused to fall back. Together they fought back the invaders until the men staggered away, bleeding and broken. When silence returned, the girl dropped the staff and sank to her knees. Her chest heaved and her body ached, but her spirit blazed brighter than ever. The human placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. His voice was calm, though his face was lined with fatigue. He told her she had proven her courage beyond doubt, and that she was no longer just a worker but his equal partner. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, unable to speak, only nodding with fierce devotion. That night they sat by the fire with the air thick from smoke and memory. The girl finally broke the silence. She told him she had once offered to work his fields by day and warm him by night, only because she had nothing else to give. But now she offered herself, not from desperation but from choice. She offered her loyalty, her labor and her heart, because she wished to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go. The human turned his eyes toward her, and for the first time she saw a true smile spread across his face. His hand reached for hers and held it firmly. He told her that from the moment she stepped onto his land, her fate had been tied to his, and that no rumor, no enemy and no storm would change that. His words struck her deeper than any blade and filled her with a warmth stronger than fire. The girl leaned closer, her forehead touching his hand. She whispered that she would never leave him, and that even if the world turned against them, she would fight by his side. He answered with steady calm, telling her that they would face whatever came together. The fire crackled as night deepened around them, but inside the farmhouse there was no fear. There was only the bond of two souls who had once been strangers, now standing as companions in a harsh world. The girl closed her eyes with peace in her heart, knowing she had not only survived but found a home. The human gazed into the flames, feeling the weight of loneliness finally lifted. In the silence of that night, they were no longer separate lives, but one.